Okay, so on the second part, as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change, right? I'm going to skip what you have seen. You are now specialists in climate change, right? And you're going to be teaching next week in your institutions about climate change. So I'm gonna focus on the effects of climate change on biodiversity, right, and on some processes. So, and like I said before, there's so many papers about this now out there, right? So it's really hard to pick what you want to read. So there's a very rich, and it's becoming very common, of course, given the importance of the matter, to study climate change effects. And I just got this IPCC. This is the first report on the IPCC. I hope you have read it. And it's now on the 5th. It's published and it's coming to the 6th, right? So back then in 1990, and that's a long time ago, right? 28 years ago, they had this prediction, right? This is interesting. So they had a prediction that by 2020, for example, we're close to it, we would have, on the worst case, business as usual scenario, we would have around 400 something ppm CO2 in the atmosphere. And we are on that, line, right? We are close to that. So we are on the worst case scenario. Everybody's driving as usual. And burning forest as usual. So what do we have since then? So this is one of the longest time series, atmospheric time series of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. This is in Hawaii, the Mauna Loa Observatory. And you see that it's increasing. You have seen this already. It's a 50% increase in the last decades. So there's a lot of carbon. We have passed 410 ppm, I think, this year. Yeah, and this is, and you can go to the NOAA website and get this like almost real time if you're interested. So this is important, right? We know that's a lot of carbon going into the atmosphere. You already know that's rising the temperatures, right? So we are increasing the temperatures, the radiation is get trapped in the atmosphere. And not only the atmospheric temperatures, but also the oceanic temperatures. So this is the average land and ocean temperature departure from average. So this is departure from average. So on average, we do have much warmer climate on the continents and in some parts of the oceans, right? So it's clear, right? We have a rising temperature trend, and we know that's bad. And this is from the last IPCC report. You can get this in the internet too, from 2014. And this is the average contribution, observed warming on Earth. And this is interesting because it matches pretty well with the combined and anthropogenic forcings. So it's really interesting to see, okay, humans are really responsible for the observed warming so far. Natural and variability, which could be like random variability, is probably there's not a problem. There's not a huge effect from natural sources. So we are, and some forcings are negative, right? They have a negative radiative balance. So at the summing of factors, we do have greenhouse gases mostly responsible for the warming, and this is pretty settled down, at least in the community, in the scientific community. And the oceans, there's a paper published not a long time ago. I didn't cite it here, unfortunately, but it says oceans out of sight, out of mind. And Professor Edmo earlier today just showed it, that the ocean is absorbing a tremendous amount of heat. And you already know 93% of the absorbed heat on Earth goes to the oceans. You know that by now. And this is the curve, the recent curve, on the global ocean heat content. So the temperatures of the oceans, of the water, is also getting warmer. And you already know by now that 30% of the atmospheric CO2 gets absorbed by the oceans, goes to that pump that I talked earlier today, biological and chemical, gets dissolved and creates acid and decreases pH. So until now, there's been an average 1 degree Celsius average increase in surface temperature. So our baseline today, and there's been talk, I think Leopoldo talked about it a few days ago, and it was important. our baseline is already a warmer ocean. Keep that in mind, right? So we already have changed Earth substantially. So you have to think that the oceans now are already warmer. They are already more acid than it were before. Okay, so put that in your mind. And you know, of course, as a consequence, ocean acidification. This is a really good review. I think I put it up there in the reading list. So you see how carbon increases in CO2 in the atmosphere is correlated with the decrease in pH, right? So this is increasing the atmosphere. This is increasing the oceans, right? Remember, they are in balance. Increasing the atmosphere, increasing the dissolved CO2 in the oceans. And you have a decrease in pH, right? So there's a present day pH decreased by 0.12 units. So again, it's a new baseline, right? So the creatures, sea creatures, the biodiversity are already facing more acidic oceans. And future projections of of decreases in pH goes from 0.2 to 0.6 units by 2050, if I'm not mistaken. So that's pretty substantial, right? So if you look at the other way, the pH decrease, this pH decrease here, it means that there's more hydrogen ions, right, which is in the balance of calcium carbonate in the ocean. We have 50% more hydrogen ions in the ocean than you would before. So it seems that this pH unit is a small change, but actually it can be a big change for organisms, and I'm going to talk about it. And like you said, you know, as we have water, deep water sinking, right, deep water formation and mixing in the oceans, we do have a deep water change in the pH, and on the aragonite, it just flew off my mind, but saturation, sorry. The aragonite saturation, which is where it becomes very difficult for calcifying organisms to calcify, right? So the aragonite saturation rate, or horizon, is basically this line here, right? This continuous line. This is the Atlantic Ocean. So this is 60 degrees south, and this is 60 degrees north. And the colors here in this graph indicate the amount of anthropogenic CO2. So darker red areas implies a stronger anthropogenic CO2, which is interesting, right? Like Professor Edmund said, the deep water column, it takes some time for it to go from the surface on the bottom and then up again. So it means that most of the anthropogenic CO2 is not uniformly dispersed in the oceans, right? Most of it now is on the surface of the oceans. But with time, we expect it to get in balance with the surface. But it's going to take millennia to get that. But even then, so in all oceans, this is the Pacific. You see that aragonite saturation horizon is shallower. And it's shallower because it has more CO2, dissolved CO2, right? It's more acid. It's an older water mass. Remember the physics there? So the water masses, the deep ocean, you get CO2 by both sinking, physical sinking, equilibrium with the atmosphere, and that takes time, but also because of respiration, right? Remember the microbes respiring organic matter? So the microbes are injecting, like I've showed this figure before, are decomposing organic matter, are respiring, and that CO2 goes into the water, into the deep waters. So as the Pacific, oh sorry, what am I doing here? Someone is playing a trick on me. Anyway, so the Pacific water has a shallower aragonite because it's more acid, it's more older water, right? And the Atlantic is more, the water is newer, right? Anyway, so you see by the colors that on the blue water is very dark blue, on the bottom of the abyss, there's pretty much very little or none CO2, human CO2. Right? It's a recent phenomenon. We are only like a decade or centuries fucking up the system, right? But yeah, I'm sorry, but we do have a stronger signature, a stronger footprint of CO2, human CO2 on the surface. So it means that calcifying organisms are going to have a harder time on their surfaces, right? Before the CO2, the pH decreases, goes deeper. And that's pretty important. That's pretty cool. Okay? But another thing that this plot shows is the shallowing. So the white, for example, the white line, sometimes the white is at the same place as the red line here. It seems that in some areas, you see that the aragonite saturation is shoaling, which makes sense, right? So you get more carbon dissolved in the oceans. The aragonite saturation horizon gets shallower. So it means that the deep water organisms that we have been talking about them, they're going to be restricted, at least the calcifying organisms, they're going to be even by time to time in the future, they're going to be restricted to shallower areas because they're not going to be able to calcify on the bottom, which has much more carbon, right? Okay, so another really important problem, which has been very limited, which has had been very limited studies, is ocean deoxygenation. And you know by physics, right? Cold water has more oxygen dissolved in it, physical process as well, in the winds and stuff that inputs oxygen in the water. The water has much less oxygen than the atmosphere, right? So oxygen is a really limiting factor, even in coastal or even in natural marine ecosystems, right? There's very little oxygen dissolved in the water. The atmosphere, I don't remember the number, but I think it's over 100 times more efficient in dissolving oxygen. We breathe it all the time than in the water. So the water is a naturally oxygen-limited environment. There's very little of it. And even worse, Professor Drude showed it yesterday, we do have a lot of input of nutrients on the coasts, right? Sewage and all kinds of stuff that increases respiration and decreases oxygen, dissolved oxygen. So this is the number of reported hypoxic coastal sites by year. And it's pretty clear that we do have two big problems here, right? The first is water is getting warmer and is losing oxygen. And the second is nutrients on the coastal areas. And the map shows that on the red dots here, we do have several areas, coastal areas, that are globally, that are reporting hypoxic events. Hypoxic events are when oxygen levels go below a threshold of 2 micromLs per liter of seawater. So that's stressful to marine organisms. Most marine organisms, at least the metazoans, they need oxygen to survive, right? So you don't have any metazoan, any animal living where there's no oxygen. Only the microbes go there, right? They can survive those conditions. So we do have both episodic events, coastal events of hypoxic areas, and we do have very long, very expanded oceanic areas of deoxygenated waters. Oxygen minimum zones, that's what they call it. And some of these areas are natural because of the biological pump, like I said. So areas with really high productivity, especially here in the Pacific and upwelling regions, you have a lot of production, and the production sinks, and the microbial loop respires that like crazy. So that's a part of it, is a natural phenomena, but it's becoming more common because of climate change and nutrients, right? So the oxygen is being really decreasing. And this is a very recent paper, I think it's this one, Breitbart et al. 2018, I think it's this year, where they called attention for a global deoxygenation of the oceans, of the open oceans. So even in areas where you have very low productivity, you are having lowering 20% sometimes decrease in oxygen. Here's so the red areas this is change in dissolved oxygen per decade. So blue areas have seen an increase in oxygen, which is almost nowhere. And most areas they are observing, and that's probably with the Argo program, they are observing decreases in the oxygen. So the ocean is getting warmer, and it's holding less oxygen, and that's horrible for the fauna, right? For the biodiversity. I'm going to talk about the impacts later, okay? Very soon. So sea level, also a problem. I'm not going to be along on this because it's a coastal, and Professor Drew talked about it yesterday too. So there's a huge increase in sea level. There's been a sea level rise because of, increase in temperature. And this is a global trend from, I think it's from this paper here, of sea level rise in global oceans. Some areas have a larger increase than others, so there's several processes influence sea level. And sea level is important for marine biodiversity too, right? It's not only on the coast, right? And why is it important? We have to think about mostly fauna that rely on light, coral reefs. So coral reefs globally, and they are usually in the hotspots of biodiversity, right? They have to keep up with sea level. They want to be in an optimum light level, right? They like photosynthesis. So sometimes when you have at longer time scales, right? So you had ocean sea level change, right? Historically. So at times when the sea level increases, the corals have to secrete carbonate, have to secrete their skeletons to keep growing upwards and keep their optimum light level for their symbionts adequate. So if you have a more acidic ocean and the sea level is rising, the corals are going to have a problem because it's going to be hard to calcify, to grow, and they're going to have to grow faster than they are used to, right? It's the same as if your mom always put the candy cabinet higher every day, right? If you grow 1 centimeter per year, and if she puts the candy cabinet 10 centimeters per year higher, you're not going to be able to access it, right? I think it's a good example, right? So it's similar, right? It makes sense. And there's also other effects, biological effects, competition with algae and other organisms. I'm going to show this a little bit. So sea level rise is not only a coastal problem, it's a global problem for corals specifically, right? So as a summary, and this is from the same paper as Scott Downey, it's a review paper, we have changes in the global ocean mean sea level, which is this curve here. So it's increasing. We have summer Arctic sea ice area in yellow, which is decreasing. The polar oceans are seeing dramatic changes during this. The Antarctic shelf too is warming up. It's probably one of the most where it's probably in the area that's warming faster globally is the Antarctic, Western Antarctic Peninsula, the polar seas, okay? There's a lot of papers on that too, okay? And we do have an increasing ocean heat content, which is this orange, sea surface temperature increasing, and mean ocean surface pH decreasing, right? And this is observed so far, and this is the projection for CO2, dissolved CO2, and pH. And this dissolved CO2, remember, that's been here. The last time we had this amount of CO2 was 40 million years ago, as I showed on that previous slide back there. So we are in 100 years from now, we're going to have CO2 levels that weren't here before 40 million years ago. That's pretty drastic, huh? So impacts on society. This is an interdisciplinary course, and I found this paper, it's up there too. There's so many interacting effects, right? So there's ocean warming, acidification, sea level rise, reduced ice, reduced oxygenation, circulation changes, precipitation changes, and increases in extreme weather events, right? All of these have multiple interactions with industries and have different economic impacts. This is really crazy, right? And this is the work that people have presented here before me, work by the guys Leandra, Leopoldo. It's so many, there's so many linkages of how ecosystem change, global ecosystem change will impact not only the biodiversity, but also our lives, our economic lives, right? So, and this is like the darker here, the darker blue is the most high confidence effects. So people are pretty sure that this is gonna happen, right? Jake was telling me, we were talking about it, and it's pretty consensus among the scientific community that a 4.5 increase in temperature by 2050, by the year 2050 is certain. So you're gonna be like, you know, a little bit older than now, and you're gonna be experiencing almost 5 degrees hotter temperatures, right? That's pretty a consensus by the scientific community. So we need to change, right? And the impacts on marine biodiversity, and some of them are pretty obvious: changes in nutrient cycles, sea level, like I said, water temperature, and there's biological responses. Many, metabolic rates, just primary production, respiration. We're gonna talk about this now. So I'm gonna make a summary of it, because like I said, there's hundreds of papers on it from all kinds of ecosystems, and you can find probably yours in there. So I'm gonna quickly talk about changes in the scale of ecosystems, like changes in primary productivity and processes. I'm gonna talk very quickly about impacts on populations, so in the ecology of marine populations, and acclimation and adaptation by some marine organisms, like acclimation to temperatures and how that's being observed so far. Okay, so for widespread changes in biodiversity, and this is an IPCC again, this is a plot from IPCC, the last report. You can see here the impacts, and the blue stuff, the blue symbols are in physical systems: glaciers, rivers, and coastal erosion. So you see impacts of this in every continent in the world, right? And the green ones, the green symbols, are impacts on biological systems, both terrestrial, wildlife, and marine ecosystems. So the fish here represent marine ecosystems. So where you see fishes, there are expected strong impacts, and the number of bars indicate the scale, very high confidence. The higher number of bars indicate very high confidence on impacts on marine biodiversity. And that's pretty much everywhere, right? So there's not much new. So like I put a quote here, right, from the report. Many terrestrial, freshwater, and marine species have shifted their geographic ranges, seasonal activities, migration patterns, abundance, and species interactions in response to ongoing climate change. So that's what we're going to talk about. So it's not only death or death of species, of organisms, they're changing patterns, they're migrating, they're changing their phenological attributes, their phenological responses. Some species are changing their reproductive cycles. Some species are shifting ranges, right? It's expected that most species are going to get out of the tropics, where it's going to be really hot, and go towards the poles to get colder winds, you know, colder waters. And that's being observed so far. So there's a strong evidence for that. So we're going to talk about this. So this is a really good review also from Polanska. It's there. And they have reviewed work, global work, it's a pretty recent one, that have showed evidences of responses to climate change over 19 years, the last 20, almost 2 decades. Of course, it's biased towards the Northern Hemisphere. There's more studies there, right? So here you have, on these blue bars here, the colored bars, you have the dark blue is a consistent response from climate change. So it means that the observed impacts are very strongly and probably related to changes in climate, temperature probably. And the light blue is equivocal, or the yellow is no change. And the thermometers here indicate how much that area has warmed since 1950. And the red ones is above ½ degree, from ½ degree to 1 degree Celsius. So when you look just at the red bars, the red thermometers, right, in areas where you have seen stronger increase in temperatures, you have also stronger evidence of altered impacts, on marine biodiversity, right? And there has been both, and these codes here, I don't expect you to read all of them now. Go to the paper if you're interested. But these symbols show changes in primary production, in bentopelagic coupling, and fisheries, plankton fisheries, in upwelling regions, on phenology of seabirds. Seabirds are highly linked to seasonal oscillations, right? So if you have longer summer times or warmer winters especially, right, or warmer springs, earlier springs, so you change both the temperature and you change the timing of seasons. You mess up the biological clock of the animal, right? These animals have evolved for a long time. It's the same as putting us in a dark room for a week. You're not going to know for some time when it's daytime and when it's nighttime. You mess your biological clock, and you are doing that in a very quickly way. So a lot of birds, they are missing their migration patterns. And what can happen when you miss that, when you mess that up? Well, polar seas are a good example. In Antarctica, the melting of the ice sheet, of the oceanic ice sheet, is very important for the beginning of the spring bloom, of the plankton bloom. So when it's spring, the ice melts, it releases ice algae, which increases productivity with the sunlight in the spring, and you give the bloom, and the krill go and eat the algae, and the whales go and eat the krill. It's a biological clock. But not only the ice is retreating, it's getting less expanded, right, during the winter, but it's retreating earlier. Well, we can have some time that the whales are going to get there in Antarctica, and the spring bloom was like a month earlier. And that's a serious change on marine ecosystems, right? So, and also I've seen a recent paper on polar too, which is really important because there's so much carbon being buried there. And the plankton is changing, right? So you're changing from big cells that krill likes, diatoms, krill loves diatoms, to picoplankton. So you're decreasing the size of the plankton in the production, and the krill cannot eat that very well. And the salps go and eat all that stuff, but the krill don't eat the salps. So you have a change of, on the trophic cascade on there. So that's pretty serious. And there's plenty of evidence for these changes on the bentopelagic coupling. So that's a big change, an ecosystemic change on ecosystems from warming, right? Like I said, the polar seas are changing the fastest. Like the glaciers on land, right? The polar seas, the ice caps are really, really dramatically changing in these days. And sea level rise, an example of sea level rise, and this is a really interesting paper, a sad one actually, Bellard et al. 2014. They were modeling the expected rise in sea level up to 6 meters here. And the pizzas here are the proportion of islands that are gonna be underwater in the future. So for Pacific islands and all the islands around the world, there's not a lot of options. There's no really high terrain. Some people are already facing really, really rapid sea level rises, and a lot of hundreds of islands. And this is the number of islands that can be underwater in the next decades. So you're going to have not only a big population problem, right, where people are going to go, right, and you're going to have ecosystemic loss of habitats. Corals, like I just said, they're going to be drowned. It's like an atoll, right? But the atoll is the subsidence of land. So corals may not keep pace with the sea level rise. And like here, this is a seawall of a friend of mine. I don't know, this might be in Indonesia or in the Pacific Islands here. So in this case, it's a coastal phenomenon, right? So the guys had to build a wall to hold up the sea, right? There was a mangrove there, but I think they decided to build a hotel was more important than the mangrove. And now they have a wall to hold up the sea. And you're gonna go to Santos next week, right, here. And Santos is a problematic area here in coastal Brazil. As we will be on the coast along Brazil, right? I live on the coast too. I already bought my apartment on highland because I expect I'm going to have the beach there sometime. It's sad, yeah, it's sad. But anyway, so we do have an imbalance between that. So we have natural coastal on the coast. We have natural ecosystems that would help us to adapt to climate change and sea level especially. Mangroves are great, like Drude said yesterday. They keep up piling up soils, and the soils go up, the sea level go high, and the mangrove would keep up. But also, not only in areas, some areas they are not there, like in this case, and other areas we have built roads or other structure behind so they cannot migrate upland. So they're going to be underwater probably too at some point. And so it's a big problem for biodiversity and for us humans, actually. And another service for biodiversity, in the case of mangroves, I just brought this slide because I think it's interesting. I saw there was a talk about the mangrove values here yesterday. And we don't have this in Brazil, but it's pretty serious in several someone here might live in some threatened areas by hurricanes. So the coastal wetlands, they do protect, they do have this service. So it's a biodiversity, right? Mangroves are biodiversity that provides services of protection, you know that? And this is a shrimp pond in Brazil, right? We talked about this yesterday. So I'm sure you know that this is really like desert if compared to a mangrove. There was a mangrove here. This is Ceará, northeastern Brazil, where all the shrimp ponds, most of them are now. And we went there, and we were interested in the blue carbon, right? Like they said yesterday, Drude said yesterday, there's a big pile of carbon accumulated in the soils, and this is it. So this is the amount of carbon in one of the natural mangrove forests, and this is the amount of carbon a shrimp pond has near it. And this is another shrimp pond. So you can have up to 85% of loss of carbon. So it's basically like the soil here where the mangrove was accumulating carbon for centuries is just like, boom, release it into the atmosphere. So the CO2 is not there. It was carried by water, but it's respired. So we consider it, we calculate it as if it was released to the atmosphere. So basically, when you have, and this is the same thing, a mean loss of carbon of about 1,500 megagrams, tons of CO2 per hectare. So 1 hectare of devastated mangrove releases about 2,000 tons of carbon, of CO2 equivalent to the atmosphere. And you might have heard that wetlands are a big thing now because of blue carbon, and blue carbon is basically like they can sequester large amounts of carbon. And this is compared, so if you lose, it's about 1,500, right? If you devastate a mangrove, you put 1,500 tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. If you devastate a tropical dry forest, a land forest, it's 40 times less. Look. So this is a typical forest, land forest. There's not a lot of carbon in the soils. 70% of the carbon, or up to 80% of the carbon of mangroves that the mangroves accumulate are in the soils, not on the trees. Whereas in the upland forests, in the Amazon, most of the carbon are on the trees, not in the soil, which is very different. So, and then it's interesting. There's a calculation by another paper by Kaufman, which is interesting. We call it the carbon footprint of a shrimp. That's the title of the paper. That's a very interesting paper. So basically, if some of you, like Drude said yesterday, he likes shrimp, and I like shrimp as well. Most of us do. So if we eat 1 kilogram of shrimp, if this shrimp was cultivated in one of these shrimp ponds, your footprint of that meal is 1,600 kilos of CO2 if you eat 1 kilo of shrimp. You know how long, what's the footprint of driving? How long you have to drive to have the same CO2 footprint? On an average car, like most of us in Brazil have, a small car, not the big trucks, the small cars. If you drive 100 kilometers, 100 kilometers, you have the same footprint. So eating 1 kilogram of a shrimp that was cultivated in that shrimp pond is equal to driving 100 kilometers. Right? So that's the things that we have to start thinking about, sustainability and stuff like that. It's really interesting, right? So these are ecosystem services. Imagine the amount of carbon that these mangroves are sequestering. Okay, so moving to acidification. And acidification is one of the other strong evidence that it will happen and is happening. It's chemical, right? There's very low uncertainty of the effects. So it's basically carbon is getting dissolved in the oceans and it's going to decrease the pH. So, and this paper is amazing. This picture is amazing. This is a scleractinian coral, a stony coral, cultivated at pH, at natural pH before, a pre-industrial pH, 8.2. This is the colony. This is the same colony at 7.4. So it's basically, it's stripped of its skeleton. The skeleton, the carbonate, dissolved. That's pretty strong, huh? I think this is pretty bad news. So nowadays, we are at about 7.9, I think, 8 point something. It was 8.2, so we're near 8. And it's expected to get at 7.6, 7.8, the pH, in the next 30 years, into 2050. So like I said, corals are going to, and calcifying organisms are going to have a really hard time to calcify, to keep their skeletons. You see, they did not die. They're still alive. They just stripped off skeletons. And of course, what happens? You decrease fitness, right? I'm going to talk about this. So now these corals are exposed to anyone that want to eat them. A fish can go and it's like a shrimp without its shell, right? Fillet, right? You know. So you decrease its adaptability, its resistance to predators, to competitors, to infections, and so on. Okay. And when you have a review, and that's the Donny review, most of these species, and then you hear here calcifiers from plankton too, right? Plankton is important. Remember the primary productivity. Plankton also calcify, and they're gonna get a hard time to calcify with the pH decrease. So from plankton to corals and processes to photosynthesis. We just talked about here. Some macroalgae do well on decreased pH, and you're gonna see here an increase in the response. So some species, nitrogen fixation, some species will do well with acid seas, and that means that they will be more adapted on the acid seas. Macroalgae is one of them, might be one of them. I'm going to show it for you. So it means that if you have a macroalgae competing for a coral on a coastal area, the macroalgae will get a better fitness. It will occupy the space of corals. And we are seeing this, right? Everywhere. The coral reefs we see today are very changed if compared to what they were before. There's more macroalgae on the coral reefs, on the coast in general. Because macroalgae, it helps their photosynthesis and their chemical stuff. I don't know the details, but you can read on papers. But anyway, so most organisms anyway will have, the calcifiers especially, we have a decreased fitness. They will be damaged somehow with increasing CO2 and decreasing pH. And this is a really cool study. It's it's a very recent one. I recommend reading it for those that like coastal ecosystems. These guys went to Japan and were studying CO2 seeps. That's really cool. So CO2 seeps are basically areas where there's CO2 coming up from the seafloor. Naturally, it's CO2 seeps. And so it means that if you have CO2 coming up from the seafloor, you have natural areas where you have more acidic waters. Whereas away from them, which are the red ones here, whereas away from them, on this other bay here where they studied, you have regular pH waters. And they studied what happens to intertidal and subtidal coral reefs, you see here, at 3 different levels of CO2 natural levels there. So they got the 300 ATM, so they went to air. We are already at 400, right? So this is the current situation. But they have areas there because of another ecosystem that have naturally pre-industrial levels. So that was the baseline before today. So when you have an increase in CO2, dissolved CO2 in these areas, look at the change. It's dramatic. You get calcifiers, they get substituted, they get replaced by marine algae. That's striking. And like I said, this is the new baseline. So what we're seeing today is not the natural condition. We already are 100 atm of CO2 more in the atmosphere. And what was the responses? So for intertidal, you see hard corals and the increase in PCO2. They basically disappear. The coralline algae that calcify, they also decrease. So these are the PCO2 levels, right? Up to 1800. Fleshy algae, like I said, they're gonna like it. Look, the fresh algae, they increase rapidly. They replace the corals. And the other calcifying fauna, they decrease too. And like I said, this is the past level. So the percentage of corals with past levels CO2. And this is current levels, 400. This is our new baseline. So it's like I said, if you're studying coral reefs now, remember, you're studying an already changed ecosystem, right? And calcifiers, it's clear. I don't have time to go through all of it, but go to the paper. It's a really interesting paper. Concerning the oxygenation effects on organisms, it's always, like I said, it's very, very little studied. We don't have, even in Brazil, anywhere in the world, people don't realize yet, or haven't measured yet, effects of decreasing oxygen on many ecosystems or individuals. It's a major gap, so it's an interesting area for study. And this paper, that's from 2008, which is 10 years ago. They were evaluating the 2 milligram per oxygen per liter. This is the standard. People report it as a major bar. So under 2 milligrams, we consider it's a hypoxic event. But these authors, they were looking into this level, right? Why 2, you know? It may change, right? Some organisms may have a higher tolerance than others and stuff. So when they looked at, they saw that median lethal concentration of oxygen, this is the 2, for some organisms like crustaceans, crabs, shrimp, and so on, it's much higher than that. So at 2, a lot of shrimp, a lot of crabs have already died. Whereas other animals like gastropods, bivalves, the mollusks, and some fishes, they have a higher tolerance. And the same thing for sublethal and sublethal effects. I've talked with some people about it. It's really important because it decreases fitness, right? So sublethal effects are also evident, much higher than 2. Look, here, fishes, crustaceans also show sublethal effects, even at oxygen levels twice as much as 2. So the bottom line here is most of coastal organisms, like I said, oxygen is a really limited property of oceans. It's a limitation in water. And most of your organisms, if you study biology in coastal waters, might experience lower oxygen effects, even sublethal. Keep that in mind. And this is a really good summary of ecological responses, from organisms to changes, to biogeographic changes. What I'm showing here is basically, in ecology, we consider, for example, for temperature, that organisms have an optimal temperature. And these lower limits, lower and high limits, and this area, this blue area here, is the fundamental niche of a species. So a species is capable of living between these extremes, the higher and the lower temperature. But the species need energy for growth. They need energy for reproduction. So they realize the niche, which is the area, the range of temperature that a species is really efficient, is really good, is much smaller than the fundamental niche. So, if you think about it, organisms are in a very competitive ecosystem. They compete with others for space, for resources, for food and everything. So they have to be in that really narrow range. And this can be other variable, right? I'm using temperature because it's a very useful one for climate change. So they have to be in that range to be successful. So if you increase temperature, like in these 4 plots, the first thing that can happen is a change in metabolic rates. So these 2 lines are, the green and the blue line, are 2 different species, for example. So if you increase temperature, the responses of these 2 species of their metabolic rate with temperature will be different, right? They're different species. So someone, the blue one in this case, is having a really strong increase in metabolic rate. And in response, it's going to have a higher resource demand than the green one. You see the bars crossed. So suddenly, with an increase in temperature, you have one species that has to have much more resources to be a good competitor, to be fit, than the other one. So now, you just favored the green one. So the green one is now more fit for that situation, if it's just simple like that. And you can also have a change in phenology, like I said, in timing. Phenology can be larval release, can be, like I said, migration, can be any comportamental response. So at the same effect, increase in temperature, and you can have a timing of life cycle, a decreased time of life cycle, whereas other species may maintain it, may be not affected by it. So it's the same. Some species will be affected and others not. And then you have the competitive fitness of decreasing by one that has been most affected in comparison to others. So this is ecology, right? It makes sense. When you go to natural ecosystems and you do this kind of research, you can see variable responses of organisms, changing fitness, right? So, and then you have variable responses to organisms. If the organism can get out of there, it's going to migrate, right? And that's the expected response for most of them that can migrate, that can change their distributional range. So most organisms, if they are affected by temperature, the tendency is going to go towards the pole, which is colder. So we expect to find much more species towards the pole in the future than in the tropics. And that's some people are looking into it. I'm going to show it very soon. Another very important thing is acclimation. So some species can adapt to it, right? So this is a very cool study by this Portuguese researcher. And she was looking at the warming tolerance. How much warming could an intertidal species or a subtidal species in the tropics or in the temperate zone area survive? And it's clear that intertidal species in the tropics, they live at closer to the extreme limit, right? So they're living the hot, very tropic, it's hot. So, of course, their tolerance to warming is very small. Remember the niche? The realized niche is very, very small, very narrow. So if you increase the temperatures a little bit, boom, it's gone. The subtidal is expected, right? It's in the water, so it can tolerate a bit more. But the bottom line here is that intertidal species, both in tropical and in the temperate zone, have a lower warming tolerance than subtidal species, and the tropical species have less tolerance than temperate ones because they are closer to the limit. And this is what makes sense, right? So that's the expectation. The tropical species are going to be just fried if temperature rises too much, whereas temperate species are going to be more tolerant. So the animals, all the animals are going to migrate south or north, right? Very cool paper, very interesting one. And like I said, there's many looking into this, both fish bentos and stuff. And the phenology changes are interesting too. This is a Polanski, this paper is also there. So what we see now is distribution range The mean range change for biodiversity has been 30 kilometers per decade, which means that in the last decades, on average, populations are migrating south or north towards the pole at a rate of 30 kilometers per decade, which makes sense, right? And so they're going to cooler areas. And this is where most of the species. So benthic algae, corals, mollusks, and phytoplankton, zooplankton, fish, seabirds, and all taxa. This is the average of all taxa. And also there's a phenology change, both in spring, and the spring is red here. So it means like 10 days earlier, like I said, plankton. The plankton are blooming, phytoplankton is blooming 10 days earlier on average than they bloomed before. And the larval, the reproduction cycles for those that have yearly reproductive cycles, or seabirds that migrate for some reason, reproduction or feeding, they are having phenological changes earlier, usually, right? Negative is earlier. So that's because mostly of early spring, it gets warmer earlier, right? Makes sense, right? Interesting. So these are phenological responses of organisms. You have to look at that too, right? So when you look at the results of everything, you look at the distribution shifts. So we look at global distribution shifts. And this is really cool. So this is a model, right? Range expansions of almost 13,000 species. So we see here basically at the two scenarios, there's the 4.5 and the 8.5 of the IPCC scenarios. So basically what we're seeing that the blue areas are going to lose species up to 1,000 species. That's the change, delta richness. So the blue areas, hotspots, right? There was a lot of species here. So the tropical areas are going to lose species at this scenario up to 2,100. And this is the change with the latitude. So this is negative, right? So the tropical, between 10 and 10 north and 10 south are going to lose species, whereas the other areas, the temperate, tropical temperate, are going to gain, so are going to be richer. So there's going to have an increase, an expected increase in richness in some areas because the tropical, the equatorial species are going to migrate north or south. And in the worst scenarios, you're going to have drastic, right? You're going to have stronger responses. So that's the output, right? So it's expected. Areas which will warm a lot, equatorial areas, are going to lose species. These species are going to migrate, and they're going to mix ranges towards the temperate zones. It's going to get richer. It's going to get more species. So the effect, it's not always a good effect because you're going to homogenize. You're going to mix biogeographies, right? Biogeographical ranges. And then you can have unexpected interactions. So, and also these researchers, they show a really interesting thing. The first effect of a distributional range is like this. You increase richness. So some species go somewhere else. That area that has received those species is going to become more diverse. But the long-lasting effect may be loss of species because those species might not be adapted to the new home. And they will compete in other interactions. So that's the thing, right? Which it's difficult to model, right? So they're only modeling where the species are going to go. And this is another really good thing that I was talking to you about the coral stuff. So what are we going to do about these changes? And this paper is really good. They looked at coral reefs. So we know that corals are going to have a hard time in the future, right? So what they did, they were calculating, so they saw, they followed a range, a change in corals, some corals in the Indian Ocean, in the Indo-Pacific. And they saw that some corals, they had a really hard time during some years, but some of them recovered. Like they followed this blue line, blue arrow. But some coral reefs, they did not recover. So what's going on? So what interferes with the ability to corals, the natural ability to recover from a bleaching event? So all of these corals bleached. at some point on the 200s, 2000s, between 94 and 2005. All of the corals bleached. But some of the corals naturally recovered. So they looked at what properties the corals that recovered had. And this was really cool. So what they did, they came up with a complexity index. And the complexity index, they looked at these areas, and they looked at corals that, before bleaching, had higher juvenile coral density, higher structural complexity, bottom roughness, higher depth, higher fish biomass, herbivores, were very important for explaining these changes. They correlate, right? So what they looked at was, in areas where you had a higher ecosystem complexity, higher naturalness, higher roughness, and deeper, they recovered much better than areas that did not, which makes sense for management. So that's what I'm saying. So for coral reef ecologists, it makes sense to look at coral reefs that have overall more higher initial complexity. And like I said, it's a sum, or it's a calculation between all of these variables. So if you have a higher coral complexity and higher depth, the probability, which are these lines here, of recovery gets higher, right? So actually, the probability of going to a regime shift, sorry, the opposite. The probability of going to a regime shift is lower. So the more complex, the less likely, independent of depth, the less likely the coral is going to go through a regime shift, which means all corals dead and macroalgae dominating. So this is really interesting. That's the stuff, like I said, that's the data, that's the variables we want to use for management. Because looking only at the species or richness difference, like I said, sometimes you're going to have higher richness because you might have new species in there. But you got to look at some functional or ecological variables to predict higher resilience of ecosystems to climate change. And this is really cool. And I bet you can apply that to several different situations on the coast or on the subtidal. And that's the basically bottom line that we use in the deep sea that I mentioned before. You're looking to complexity. You're looking at habitats where species can be both preserved and they can also maintain their ecological functions. They can reproduce, they can disperse larvae, they can be outwelling larvae, right? Recolonizing impacted areas adjacent, closer to them. So for summary, we do see historically we are following the worst case scenario, right? We are going to the business as usual scenario for CO2. The temperatures have already increased by 1 degree Celsius in the oceans, in coastal and global. And like I said, a 4.5 C increase is almost a consensus. It's going to come up. The new report, IPCC report, should come later this year or early next year. And all of these effects, warming, acidification, the oxygenation, they are very, very, very strongly likely to occur. So and we are already studying different ecosystems. And remember, there's always an interplay between the oceanic variables, the climate variables, and the species. The species try to adapt. They try to survive, right? Like I showed earlier, some species, corals, forams, they have been on Earth for millennia, right? Millions of years. And they're going to adapt somehow. And of course, we have now humans on Earth. We didn't have humans, not that we know, 40 million years ago. So it's very possible, like this last example of the coral prevention, the coral management, that we can pick up, if we can find them, choose habitats or ecosystems that show are more likely resilience to climate change, and look closer into these areas and try to protect them so we can adapt until all the oil is over or until we change our economy towards a cleaner economy, right? That's the easy task, right? So the conclusions are like I said, there's virtually climate change effects from the tropics to polar latitudes. And there's going to be strong habitat and biodiversity changes. We need to know what we're going to do about that. We should keep in mind that, like I just said, we need to do an adaptive management. That's the cool word that I could find for conclusions, which is basically consider climate change in our protection measurements or in our management, right? Climate change is already here. And much of that, we need sustainable observations. Like I said, it's going to take years. Like in Rebentos and in our network, the idea was to monitor these communities for decades. But it's really hard to both be able to do that and to find money to do that. And that's the last words here. So to sell your work, it's going to be increasingly important if you're working with climate change, if you're working with management. So we need to do a really really good job. When you're writing, and you're going to be writing proposals, research proposals very soon, you need to do it very, very, very carefully. You're going to be not only competing with many other fields, you're competing for public money, scarce. It's getting scarce, right? It's hard to find money, especially in Brazil nowadays. So you have to be, you have to look for opportunities. You have to go to the job, sell your work well, and show the importance. Not only the ecological, biological, but the human, social importance of your work. I would like to finish with thanking all the organizations, all the girls that made us a fantastic support. I really enjoyed this week here. I'm really glad that I had the chance to spend the whole week with you guys. I'm leaving today, but my contact is here. You now have my Twitter, and so I wish you well success in both this course and your careers. Thank you.
So, me again, Dragana from Serbia. And I was wondering, because you were talking about migrating birds, you were talking about changes in phenology, you were talking about all of these things. And I remembered, because me and my colleagues in the first semester studied in France, and we were studying very intensively the Gironde estuary. And the problem with the Gironde estuary is very, very complex, because you have mixing of salt and fresh water. And the particularity of this estuary is that they have what they call bouchon vaseau, which is a mud plug. So it creates anoxic conditions, and it creates the impossibility of species to pass because it's like a plug. And also there are a lot of migrating species that go to reproduce in the ocean or to feed in the ocean and come to reproduce in the estuary. So it's a very complex situation. And also the phenology of the species is changing because of climate change and because of everything that's going on. So the blooms are coming later or earlier, and the species that migrate have the problem to meet the blooms and to feed. So do you think there is some kind of solution, and is anybody working on such complex issues?
Well, the quick answer is no. I don't have any idea for the solution. Yeah, estuaries and coastal sites are very sensitive to climate change. There's a lot of pollution, and there's, like you said, many variable factors, impacts going on, right? Sewage, chemicals, and all the kind of stuff. So it's really a challenge. I mean, I don't know the case. I mean, and I'm sure there's people studying that. So for estuaries, like Drew showed yesterday, it's a complex situation because there's dams and there's precipitation changes, salinity, and all kinds of stuff. It's not an easy task. But I was talking to Jack earlier this week, and he told me about the story of the cod in Canada, which was a similar stuff that he said. So the cod goes to the fjords to eat, and they reproduce on the margin, on the outer fjords. So what happened in the 2000s is that the cod collapsed, the fisheries, and they thought it was fisheries, so it was a little bit of fisheries. But actually, when they saw, just to put the story short, what they saw was just like a strong climatic change. So they had cooler water on the surface, and the cod was then in the warmer waters below, and they were not accessing their feeding grounds. So that's why the stock collapsed. But then climate changed again, and then the cod, so there was a thinning of the surface cold water, so the cod would rise up and eat again, and the stocks recovered. So for areas that are natural, if we can find the estuaries, are really hard to find a non-altered estuary, right? But for areas that are natural, some processes, they do have long cycles, right? Natural cycles. And sometimes we try to find them out. We're seeing here in mangroves in Brazil, sometimes you have mangroves just die because of lower precipitation. And then if everything goes well, they're going to recover naturally if precipitation comes back in good years. And we have an El Nino, so it's climate, it's very complex, so we need to bear that in mind.
Can I just add to that question?
Yeah, I think so. Let's talk. Yeah, we can come to me and afterwards. Yeah. So we give opportunities to others too.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Angelo, for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Issa Elegbede from Nigeria and study in Germany. I want to ask that most of the time we discuss about acidification that affects shellfishes and coral reefs. Has there been documented research on how it affects fin fishes?
Very cool. I don't know. You're asking me if I have seen it?
Yeah, you have seen it, or there has been documentations on that. I
haven't seen. No, I don't. I mean, not direct impacts, or I suppose there's chain impacts, right? You impact if fish eat something that's impacted. I suppose you can find this. But like I said, it's a good question too, because sometimes it's very hard to find a good correlation between climate or acidification to a variable, but maybe it's an indirect effect of something else, right? So it's hard. Marine ecosystems are really complex.
Professor, thank you very much for the speak. It was really good. I am Erwin Martí from Mexico, and I wanted to ask you about if you can speak us a little more about some geoengineering strategies like ocean enrichment to mitigate the effects of the emissions to the atmosphere.
Good question. Geoengineering, increasing primary productivity, have been not long ago have been raised as an option for soaking up more carbon, right? So, and there were people in the University of Hawaii when I was studying there that they were really clever, and they even got these pumps, artificial pumps. So they got like this 200-meter long pumps that would be pumping with the waves. So the idea of the pump was to bring low, rich nutrient water to the surface, and that nutrients would increase primary productivity and then sink as particulate carbon. And there has been some ships that have some areas we have high chlorophyll, low iron limitation for those that work with plankton. And they have also tried to dump iron in some high latitude temperate ocean areas to increase primary productivity. But the problem with that is that is quantifying the amount of carbon really sequestered. And we have to bear in mind that if carbon goes from the surface to the deep ocean, it doesn't mean it's sequestered, right? It's on the bottom of the ocean. So it might take 1,000 years for that to resurface. But it can be respired, right? There's microbes. So the carbon sink, really, the important carbon sink would be burial in the bottom of the ocean, like it's done in mangroves and stuff. So to summary, I think they have abandoned that. I haven't seen more research done on that because I don't think they found, either they couldn't prove there was a significant increase in export in the biological pump after these experiments, or there's also been doubts about other additional impacts, or deoxygenation could be one. You're increasing a lot of productivity, and then the carbon sinks, and then microbes respire and suck up the oxygen that is there. So you are pumping carbon, but you are decreasing oxygen. It's not an easy way. It's linked. So, yeah, but it has been thought about it.
Someone? Dragana, do you want to ask something?
Yeah, I think we do have time.
So it's related to the question I asked before. I was wondering, with the migrations to the polewards, in the case that I'm talking about, it would be north. So could the species that were coming to this estuary, could they change their location and go further north to do all the things they used to do?
It's a good question. We were trying, for example, in Brazil, for estuaries in Brazil, we do have cosmopolitan species, right? So species that are both south and north. So they're pretty much connected. And I suppose, I don't know the specifics of the connectivity and oceanography of your area, but I suppose that for coastal, the range of species on the coastal zones are generally larger than on the deep sea. So the dispersal potential is much larger. So I would guess that a lot of these species are already distributed on the north. I don't know the latitude, but some species, they will go to the north. But we have to remember that low temperatures will be a limitation to the poles, because a lot of these species, they will not support lower temperatures, among other factors like the biological factors, competition, and adaptation to new habitats. So it's a very intricate, relationship in the connectivity and competition with temperate fauna. And there has been this competition showed for coral reefs. So one of the reasons that coral reefs do not go to temperate areas is not only because of temperature, because corals are on the deep sea, right? So some corals can bear lower temperatures. We have mesophotic corals that are at 100 meters depth. So some corals do like colder temperatures, but a lot of them cannot compete for space with algae. So it's one example, right? So even though sometimes the species can survive lower temperatures, but they are it's the fitness case. They are not fit to survive those conditions. So, and corals are a really good example, right?
Yeah, exactly the corals I was talking to you before about, those are temperate corals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And solitary corals, we have corals like solitary, that you said, in Antarctica. There's a lot of them in the Antarctic. So they like sometimes, heterotrophic, right? They're not photosynthetic, so they're heterotrophic. There are corals at 1,500 meters, deep sea corals. So, and reefs at 1,500 meters. But, and some of these species are very widely distributed. So Lophilia, for example, is one of these species, deep sea species. It goes from the North Sea to the South Atlantic, and it's very broad. So it's an amazing dispersal. I'm not sure if they're changing these species, but it seems to be one species that it's amphi-Atlantic. It's amazing. So.
Okay, thank you.
Here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm going to frame my question from a political point of view. I'm wondering what will be your expectation, or what will you advise Kenyan government? In 1998, we have, in the coast of Mombasa, we have a bleaching event due to a El Nino event, and it was very strong. But recently, in that same port city of Mombasa, we have oil exploration. It began, it has started effectively. So if you were an advisor to the president, knowing that in the next few years we're going to have the same bleaching event, at the same time you have oil exploration going on, this coral reef is very close to the shore, what will you tell the president, possibly? Thank you.
Good question. It's like I said, oil exploration is broad, right? It's this Africa, South America, the US, everyone. It's hard to say, okay, you cannot explore here because you have corals. Brazilians are trying to do that in the Amazon now. They say they found some, it's not really corals, but it's rhodolites and sponge beds. So I think, the wise decision is to look into, like I said, management, right? So if you got a reasonable mapping of where are the corals, and you look there at the distribution, and you set apart some areas for these corals to be. It's like the oil rigs, like I said, it's not a huge extent impact, right? So, and a lot of times the companies, they go and drill close to the corals to avoid corals. They can do that. So in Brazil, for example, like I said, when you have an oil rig, you avoid worse damage, which would be trawling. So at that aspect, it's a good thing that the oil rigs are there, because otherwise people could be trawling, and it's a much wider and damaging impact. On the other hand, if it's deep sea, you have the risk of a blowout. The chances increase, and the chances that the problem, which is the problem here in Brazil, the problem is that we don't have the meaning, which I believe it's going to be happening in Africa, of going there and see what's going on independently. Here in Brazil, we have the dog taking care of the sausage, right? It's a conflict of interest. It's absurd. So the companies, they do the monitoring. It's ridiculous, right? So I would tell your president, okay, you can do that, and do it smartly, position smartly, and have an independent, scientific, proper assessment of the impacts. That's the way to do it. That's the way they're doing in Europe for years, for decades. So you got to have independent scientific assessment to make sure they're not,
Another one? Last one? Yeah, because we are almost in the time of the tutoring.
Hi, Angelo. Great talk.
Okay,
my name is Mauricio from Brazil, and I wanted to ask, what's in your opinion the most successful action we gotta do to resolve the climate change?
Oh.
Yeah, I think we gotta ask this to each one of you.
Yeah.
We gotta search for different solutions.
Yeah. Well, I think we are going that path slowly, but we're going, which is cleaner energy, right? It's carbon. It's a carbon problem, right? So the rich countries are going ahead. We have a lot of examples. I think we have a lot of, let's be positive here, right? I want to cheer you up. So, yeah. So you can see on the developed world, cleaner energy is going there. There's technology. It's expensive now, but there is technology. Solar panels and all this stuff. And we do have several countries banning oil already, right? New Zealand, I think some countries in the European Union are banning oil extraction. So I think we are towards a low carbon nation. I think that's the main thing. The second thing is that we do need to adopt as most as possible a more responsible relationship with the environment, right? And the plastic, Mr. Plastic is here in front of me. And I was expecting to watch a plastic talk from you, but maybe you guys are going to see it. But anyway, so this it's all about, so climate change in the long term, it's carbon. It's clear, right? So it's going to build up. It's going to reach an asymptote, I expect. Maybe we're not here at that time. And then it's going to fall down. The ocean is going to suck it up. And we do have other measures to preserve the environment, to maintain good ecosystem health. So, well, cleaner energy, no doubt. Yeah, clean energy. Cars and fossil fuels and there's also, if you look at the emissions, fossil fuels and burning, right? Burning the forests, right, are big sources of carbon.
What about stopping eating meat?
Well, that might be another issue, but I mean, we want to have food for everybody, so it's a tricky question, right? It's a tricky question, like the eating meat, like the Japanese eat seafood, and some people eat mammals and stuff. It's like, I'm not saying we should eat mammals, but I think it's much harder to explore than the carbon problem. And this is sustainability we're talking about, right? But it's emissions, yeah. It's a lot of.
There is a figure, a very interesting figure, that may drive changes to a low carbon society, which is the figure the Prime Minister of Canada mentioned it to Trump some months ago in terms of the potential of creating value, combating climate changes. She said that the estimate is about $30 trillion. The opportunity, it's really, really big. And then if you look, if you show it to society, to entrepreneurs, perhaps you can have a very fast change towards carbon-free or carbon-less society.
And if you look at the IPCC reports, and they're really good, you should all read them. We don't have to kill it, right? Kill CO2. We have just to, we still have chance to reduce. I don't know the numbers, but maybe 30% or 40%. So this is achievable. We can achieve a sustainable emission rate globally, reducing 20-30% of that. I don't know the exact number, but you don't have to drastically change humanity. That's what I mean. So there's opportunity for change and still holding up the climate, effects. And we don't have to become,
Perhaps stop smoking would be a very
maybe
nice first step. Why not?
Angelo, hi.
Yeah.
You can talk.
Rafael, very fast.
Yes, fast.
Very fast.
Carbon sink. I have heard that there are some places on the ocean that you have more breathing than production. So would be that some inverse carbon sink, some exploitation of carbon from the ocean to the atmosphere. Have you heard something on this preparation of this class or something?
Well, yeah. I mean, like you saw, the poles are big carbon sinks, and the oligotrophic ocean, there's more respiration. So it's natural, and the surface waters are in balance in general. So
yeah, what about this balance, of the breathing and the?
Yeah. So the ocean is still sinking carbon, but not as much. Like as you saw, it's 30%, right, of the CO2. But And it's going to increase. It's going to increase sequestering carbon as long as the atmospheric carbon increases, so it's in balance. But the productivity, the burial, we don't know if it's increasing, right? The burial. So there's clearly, if you increase the atmospheric carbon, the ocean is going to increase its sucking carbon, and it's going to get more acid. So that's the balance, basically. Globally.
Well, very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. We took the picture. Yeah. Before and after. Huh?